My dear sisters and brothers, today's edition of A Taste of Sri Aurobindo is a passage from Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga and talks about what a true synthesis is. Before I go further, the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Synthesis is something that not only Sri Aurobindo found it necessary to work out in the field of yoga, it is something that we feel the necessity for in several other fields, such as psychology, working out a synthesis between Indian and Western psychology, in the field of medicine, particularly, working out a synthesis between allopathy, Ayurveda, naturopathy, homeopathy, and other systems of medicine. And therefore, the general principles that he talks about, synthesis in the synthesis of yoga, can be of great value in working out any of these other syntheses that we feel the necessity of. Let me read out from this chapter titled Synthesis, which is the fifth chapter in the introductory section of the Synthesis of Yoga. By the very nature of the principal yogic schools, each covering in its operations a part of the complex human integer and attempting to bring out its highest possibilities, it will appear that a synthesis of all of them, largely conceived and applied, might well result in an integral yoga. But they are so disparate in their tendencies, so highly specialized and elaborated in their forms, so long confirmed in the mutual opposition of their ideas and methods, that we do not easily find how we can arrive at their right union. An undiscriminating combination in block would not be a synthesis, but a confusion. Nor would successive practice of each of them in turn be easy in the short span of our human life and with our limited energies, to say nothing of the waste of labor implied in so cumbrous a process. I'll skip a few lines and go to the next page. The synthesis we propose cannot then be arrived at either by combination in mass or by successive practice. It must therefore be effected by neglecting the forms and outsides of the yogic disciplines and seizing rather on some central principle common to all, which will include and utilize in the right place and proportion their particular principles, and on some central dynamic force, which is the common secret of their divergent methods and capable, therefore, of organizing a natural selection and combination of their varied energies and different utilities. Let me go over it slowly. By the very nature of the principal yogic schools, each covering in its operations a part of the complex human integer and attempting to bring out its highest possibilities. Now, here Sri Aurobindo is talking about something that is true of all schools of yoga. What do the schools of yoga, what do all these schools of yoga do? Each covers in its operations a part of the complex human integer. Now, the human being may be considered as a whole, an integer, an integer is a whole number. But then each principal school takes up a part of this integer, which means a fraction of it. If the human beings be taken as a combination of the body and the mind, then one yogic school may take up only the body and another the mind, at least principally the body, and another principally the mind. So by the very nature of the principal yogic schools, each covering in its operations a part of the complex human integer and attempting to bring out its highest possibilities. Now, what does the school of yoga do? Picking up one fraction of the human being, say the body or the mind, and then tries to bring out its highest possibilities. Now, we normally don't utilize all the possibilities of the body or the mind, but through appropriate discipline, following a methodized effort, it is possible to bring out these highest possibilities. The body is capable of much more than we normally think, and so is the mind. And to bring out these highest possibilities is the aim of the various schools of yoga. By the very nature of the principal yogic schools, each covering in its operations a part of the complex human integer and attempting to bring out its highest possibilities, it will appear that a synthesis of all of them, largely conceived and applied, might well result in an integral yoga. So, if we work out a synthesis, it would appear natural that we would reach something which is integral or total and may therefore be called integral yoga. And thereby, we may be able to work out the highest possibilities of each part of the being, which would be much better than working out the highest possibilities of just one part, like the body or the mind. But then it's not as easy as it looks. And why? Because they are so disparate in their tendencies, so highly specialized and elaborated in their forms, so long confirmed in the mutual opposition of their ideas and methods that we do not easily find how we can arrive at their right union. Their tendencies are divergent rather than convergent. They're highly specialized and elaborate in their forms. That is, the external practices. It may be the asanas and pranayamas for the school that emphasizes physical perfection, and meditation would be the principal form or the technique used by the school which emphasizes mental perfection. So there is such a uh, contrast between the types of techniques used or the forms used in practice. So long confirmed in their mutual opposition of their ideas and methods. On top of that, each has its own collective ego, and therefore, for a long time, there has been a sort of a mutual opposition between them, opposition of their ideas and methods. And therefore, it is not easy to work out a union. But then we can think of the various ways in which such a union may be worked out. And two possibilities come to mind, which Aurobindo talks about in the next few lines. The first possibility is a combination of the two, keeping them side by side. But then that would not be a true synthesis. An undiscriminating combination in block would not be a synthesis, but a confusion. Now, let's see, what this placing side by side or a mere combination, what does it mean? What it would mean is, say, some school of yoga might say that we practice a union of different schools of yoga. In the morning, we practice asanas and pranayamas. So we have done hatha yoga. And then we do some manual work, that is karma yoga. And then we also have lectures on yoga, so that is Jnana Yoga. We also have sessions of devotional music, that is Bhakti Yoga. And we also meditate for some time every day, that is Raja Yoga. So from morning till evening, there's a timetable worked out, what time we'll do which of these things. And therefore, we are practicing a combination of different schools of yoga. Better than practicing any one of them exclusively, but all the same, that is not a true synthesis. It could mean a confusion, and this can be particularly understood when we uh, apply the same to, say, medicine. So within the same complex, within the same hospital, you have Ayurveda being practiced in one part of the hospital and allopathy in another, for example. Now, just by doing that, placing them in the same building, you do not really work out a synthesis. There would only be a confusion. The patient would not know which way to go, which will be better for him. The doctors in the two sections may not be talking to each other. And therefore, this will not really give us a synthesis or a union. It will give us only confusion. So, an undiscriminating combination in block would not be a synthesis but a confusion. Is there another possible way in which we may work out the synthesis? One may think that successive practice of each of them would lead to some sort of a union. Now, when applied to yoga, it would mean that a person might say that, well, I'll practice Hatha Yoga for 10 years and then Raja Yoga for the next 10 years, and then the Yoga of the Gita for another 10 years. Now, this type of a practice, again, would not be a true synthesis, apart from the fact that it would be extremely difficult and tedious. So, Sri Aurobindo says nor would successive practice of each of them in turn be easy in the short span of our human life. After all, life is short, time is limited, and therefore this sort of successive practice will not be easy. And on top of that, we have limited energies. And to say nothing of the waste of labor implied, because it will be a lot of labor without any real gain. And the process would be cumbrous or tedious. And therefore, if neither placing them side by side in a combination nor successive practice of different forms of yoga is a true synthesis, what is a true synthesis? Now, let me go to the next page. The synthesis we propose cannot then be arrived at either by combination in mass or by successive practice. So these two are ruled out. But is there a way of doing it? And that Sri Aurobindo explains in the next few lines. It must therefore be effected by neglecting the forms and outsides of the yogic disciplines. So the first thing we should do is to not give too much importance, neglect to some extent the forms and outsides. That is, the techniques and the practices which are the most visible part of the different schools of yoga, say asanas and pranayamas in case of hatha yoga, and meditation in case of raja yoga. So we neglect them. Neglect them doesn't mean that we don't make any use of them, but then how much we use them, to what extent, that will come a little later. And but why neglecting the form and the outsides is important is because the external practices, Sri Aurobindo felt, and we can easily relate to it because that is quite true even today. The external forms, the visible forms of different schools of yoga had come to undermine the spirit underlying yoga. And in fact, one of the major aims of this synthesis was to revive the spirit because the external forms are important, but at the same time, we should not pay so much attention to them, uh, develop such an obsession with the exact way of doing this asana or that asana and this method of meditation versus that method of meditation, instead of getting obsessed with this sort of minutiae, which are not of great value, which in fact take us away from the spirit of yoga, is something that is not desirable, but had happened and continues to be so to quite an extent even today, and therefore we can relate to it. But Sri Aurobindo felt that that was not the right thing to do, and therefore, even at the expense of neglecting these outer forms to some extent, what is important is to revive the spirit. And how can we do that? In a true synthesis is what he's talking about in the next few lines. So instead of external forms, what do? We seize rather on some central principle common to all. Is there something common to all schools of yoga, which is the central principle of all schools of yoga? The idea with which they all started, the idea which the classics, in fact, emphasize, but in practice, with over time, has been neglected. So, what is that central principle? The central principle is to start from where we are, and we all accept that we are imperfect, whether it is the body or the mind. They are both in an imperfect state, but it doesn't mean that these different parts of the being, the body and the mind, are not capable of moving towards perfection. They have that ability. They can get better than they are and move towards perfection, that is to a state where there will be no defect left. And when there is no defect left, that or no nothing, nothing, no fault left, that would be the state of perfection. Now, perfection by very definition is something that we identify with God. Man is imperfect, only God is perfect. And therefore, if we are able to reach this point of perfection, we would achieve some sort of a union with God. So that is what yoga is about. Now, one might say that is it really possible for a mere human to do that? It is difficult, but the select few who have done it have demonstrated that it is possible. And why it is possible is because we have the divine within us. So all we have to do is to remove that barrier between our own divine essence, the soul, and the different parts of the being, the body and the mind, which are only surface instruments for giving uh, an expression to the soul. There's the visible forms of this divine essence for action in the world. So, if we remove that barrier between what is perfect in us, that is our soul, and let the soul illumine our body and mind, the body and the mind can move from that present state of imperfection towards perfection. So, this is the principle that is common to all schools of yoga. So, having understood this central principle, after that, what do we do? To get something also from all these different schools of specialization, because we should not throw away the gains that these schools of specialization have made. And so, what should we do? We should include and utilize in the right place and proportion their particular principles. There means different schools of yoga. So, we use and include in the synthesis in the right place and proportion. That is, with a sense of proportion and at the right place, and with a degree of flexibility which leaves scope for each seeker to find his or her own path. Because everybody may not be so inclined towards physical perfection. Yes, nobody should neglect the body, but then everybody may not be interested in the type of perfection that Hatha Yoga can take us to. And therefore, that possibility of giving each individual that flexibility of developing each part of the being to the extent the person is interested should be available in that synthesis, which means that we take away the type of rigidity which goes with many traditional schools of yoga. So we do that by including and utilizing in the right place and proportion their particular principles. That is the particular principles of different schools of yoga. And we add that to the central principle which is common to all of them. And on this and on some central dynamic force which is the common secret of their divergent methods and capable therefore of organizing a natural selection and combination of their varied energies and different utilities. So we make use of the secret that is common to all of them, that is making use of the inherent divinity in each one of us. That is the secret of each of them, and that is why they work. The body is able to improve its capacities in terms of strength and flexibility, as well as in terms of self healing. And in the same way, the mind is able to improve its capabilities of original and critical thinking, and being able to see even something which is outside the realm of the ordinary mind through intuition, for example. Now, these are all possibilities which are open to the uh, human organism, and the extent to which a person will go, in which sphere, in the sphere of the body, or the prana, or the mind, would depend upon each individual, and that sort of a mix should be permissible in a synthesis, and that in fact would be a true synthesis. So a true synthesis would add to the central principle common to all schools of yoga, the particular principles of the different schools of yoga being synthesized to the extent that they seem appropriate for general use. And within that, again, the emphasis on one particular school or the other, the techniques of one school or the other, could differ from one seeker to another, depending upon his inclinations, temperament, and capacity, and circumstances, and so on. So that flexibility should be possible, and that is something which had disappeared in the different schools of yoga, which had become rather form obsessed and rigid in their approach. So now let me go over these lines again. By the very nature of the principal yogic schools, each covering in its operations a part of the complex human integer and attempting to bring out its highest possibilities, it will appear that a synthesis of all of them, largely conceived and applied, might well result in an integral yoga. But they are so disparate in their tendencies, so highly specialized and elaborated in their forms, so long confirmed in the mutual opposition of their ideas and methods, that we do not easily find how we can arrive at their right union. And after that, Sri Aurobindo goes on. uh, to the ways in which we might think a union might be possible. An undiscriminating combination in block would not be a synthesis, but a confusion. Nor would successive practice of each of them in turn be easy in the short span of our human life and with our limited energies, to say nothing of the waste of labor implied in so cumbrous a process, in such a tedious process. So, if these two methods are ruled out, then what is it that a true synthesis is? Mhm. That comes on the next page. The synthesis we propose cannot then be applied at sorry, the synthesis we propose cannot then be arrived at either by combination in mass or by successive practice. It must therefore be effected by neglecting the forms and outsides of the yogic disciplines and seizing rather on some central principle common to all, which will include and utilize in the right place and proportion their particular principles, and on some central dynamic force, which is the common secret of their divergent methods and capable, therefore, of organizing a natural selection and combination of their varied energies and different utilities. Thank you.